Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Believe it or not, today's gospel reading makes me think of the television show RuPaul's Drag Race. For those who have not seen it, you probably know who RuPaul Andre Charles is, the pioneering entertainer who's played a crucial role in mainstreaming drag culture in the United States and around the world. Some would even credit RuPaul and the popularity of drag with growing acceptance of a wider spectrum of gender expressions, helping people feel more accepting and loving toward others and themselves. RuPaul's Drag Race, which has now been on TV for 12 years, is a reality show in which contestants compete to become America's next drag superstar. They're judged on their makeup, fashion, runway walks, acting, singing, humor, and of course dancing. Each episode culminates in an elimination in which the lowest scoring two contestants must lip sync for your life. In season 6, the contestant Bianca Del Rio, who has gone on to become the most successful alum of the show, was confronted by a fellow competitor, Courtney. Courtney chastised Bianca for not varying runway looks enough. I wonder if you were going to turn out a look that we haven't seen already. Bianca's response, "Not today, Satan, not today." In the gospel reading we just heard earlier, Jesus foretells his death and resurrection for the first time in Mark's account. Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days be raised from the dead. We know how the story goes, so it's not a surprise to us that Jesus prophesies the events of Good Friday and Easter. But if we step inside the story, we can remember that the disciples didn't know how everything was going to turn out. They had no idea, because this was the first time they were hearing about this. After all, they were no doubt still feeling the rush of witnessing Jesus' great miracles and hearing his compelling teaching. And now he's telling them that he's going to die and then rise again, not at the end of the time in the general resurrection, but in 3 days. All a little confusing for them, I'm sure. Of course, up until this point, it wasn't all miraculous healings and feasts for thousands from a few fish. Jesus had begun forecasting the difficulties he and his disciples would face, but he'd never before said that he would die. And this probably came as a shock to Peter and the other disciples, because after all, had not long before this Jesus walked on water? How could he possibly die? Someone who could do that. Troubled, Peter speaks to Jesus privately and sharply criticizes him. This cannot happen, he thinks. Even though Jesus had upended, turned over upside down so many of the assumptions and expectations of the disciples, it's still inconceivable to Peter that God's anointed one, the Messiah, could die. The Messiah, after all, would free Israel from bondage, destroy its enemies, and restore it to glory. True, the prophet Isaiah had spoken of a suffering servant who would die for the people, but this was not really at the time part of the messianic framework of first century Judaism. So Peter is understandably confused and troubled by Jesus' words. Jesus' response was a harsh rebuke to Peter. "Get behind me, Satan." The word used here for Satan is the same we heard last week when Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by the devil. The Hebrew word Satan means to oppose or to accuse, and it's sometimes rendered as the adversary or accuser. This figure in Scripture has connotations of a prosecutor in a divine court whose role was to point out the faults of human beings, as in the book of Job. Mark's account of the temptation in the wilderness is very brief, it's just that mention. But in Matthew and Luke, Jesus resists the devil 3 times after he is tempted to leave his mission with the promise of food, safety, and earthly power. But Jesus resists. Away with you, Satan. In this reading today, by echoing that earlier response to the accuser's temptation, Jesus is framing Peter's words as another temptation. Just as the tempter in the wilderness hoped to get Jesus to deny who he really was, Jesus hears Peter's rebuke as an effort to turn him away from his true mission. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things, Jesus tells Peter. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus adds to that statement, you are a stumbling block to me. Peter, as it turns out, still misunderstands the nature of Jesus' mission, and so he tempts him to another path. Just before today's reading, Peter had declared his belief that Jesus is the Messiah. But Peter and Jesus had different ideas about what that meant. The common understanding at the time was that the Messiah would deliver the people from the rule of the Roman Empire, or any empire. They would be free, and the Messiah would be a ruler, a political and military figure, as well as a spiritual one. The Messiah would bring about a mighty victory for the people who had been so long oppressed. But Jesus did not come to build an earthly kingdom, but to bring the kingdom of heaven, the reign of God, to earth. To accomplish this joining of earth and heaven, Jesus would experience both death on the cross and new life through the resurrection. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. I wonder how Jesus' first century followers would have heard this. Remember that the cross was not yet the cross. It was not yet an instrument of salvation. It was instead an instrument of torture and execution, an instrument of intimidation of communities meant to suppress rebellion. Jesus' followers probably all knew someone, or knew someone who knew someone who'd been put to death on a cross for opposing Roman rule. It's possible that some or all of his disciples would have heard his call to carry the cross as a call to rebellion. Take up your cross as you resist the Romans. They may kill you, so go ahead and embrace what might be your fate. But that, of course, is not what Jesus meant. Jesus came instead to heal the world and to remake it in the image of God. This healing work means recentering our focus in all aspects of our lives so that we orient ourselves around God, and so that we reflect the image of God into the world. Jesus exhorts Peter to reorient his mind on divine things, not earthly things. Jesus tells his disciples that if they want to truly follow him, they need to take up their crosses. And what that meant, to take up our cross, means to serve one another, to give of ourselves for the sake of others, just as Jesus would do. He took up the cross for love of the world. Taking up our cross means to help one another bear one another's burdens and joys. In doing so, we embrace who we are at the core of our being. We are children of God, made in God's image. And God's image is, of course, love. Love is how we show the world what God looks like. God's love was poured into creation, was poured into the universe in creation, an offering of divine self-love that generated new life. Then Jesus, the Son of God, came among us, and this incarnation was another divine self-offering to renew creation and remind us who we are. So the way of the cross is the way of self-offering love. When Jesus told his disciples to take up their cross and follow him, and those who want to save their life will lose it, his message is this: die to your old self so that you may find true life. Give up on the world as you knew it to join me in remaking it in the image of God. The kingdoms of earth cannot compare to the life you will find in the reign of God. Now, does that sound like a tall order? Yes, sure, of course. But God is always with us. When we take up our cross to bear our own and one another's burdens, we are not alone. God is with us. Satan, the accuser, the tempter, is that which would make us doubt ourselves and others. Satan is that which tempts us to give up on our hopes and aspirations because they seem too big or too far away. Satan is that which makes us dwell more on the bad than on the good. That which makes us believe that we are characterized more by original sin than original blessing. Resist those voices of temptation and accusation. Remember that Christ took up the cross because he loves us and because he knows what we are capable of, because we are children of God. And if we ever feel like we're not up to the task, that we're not good enough, or we just feel overwhelmed, we can try our spiritual practices that we hope to cultivate in times like this, in times of Lent. And we might take a breath, we might say a prayer, we might practice mindfulness, we might talk with a trusted friend or advisor, and then through these practices, gently push aside those feelings of unworthiness as we remember that we are children of God. And if you find that your spiritual practices do not, in that moment, give you a sense of peace and confidence, well, remember the words of Bianca Del Rio. Not today, Satan, not today. Amen.